I'm going to tell you about the Longford River. All I know, I've been studying the Longford for about 7-8 years now, and I'm still not there yet. I've still got a long way to learn, because every time I think I've cracked it and I've understood everything there is to know about the Longford, I find a little bit more. So I'm going to start my conversation with an apology by saying I don't know it all, and there might be some bits you know and I don't know, and if there is, please tell me afterwards, because it's a little bit of information, but I'll do my best and crack on, and hopefully you'll enjoy it and learn a few things tonight as well. So we're talking about the Longford River. I usually start with this one just to put it all in perspective, because it's where I work, it's what I look after, it's my bread and butter, if you like. And I always start this sort of talk with this, is that we always take for granted there's water everywhere, don't we? But there's nothing to use. You would have thought Hampton Court Palace, being next to the Thames, water would not be a problem. It would be the last problem that they would have. But that's not quite true. Although the River Thames runs right past Hampton Court, it's the wrong kind of water. It's too low. It's not drinkable, and without a Teddington lock in place, the water would have gone up, flooded in the winter, and would have gone down in the summer. So much so that horses would have been walking up and down the Thames. So the river really wasn't much good for anything you wanted to do in your garden at Hampton Court, let alone anything you might want to do in Bushy Park, part of the park. And if you're really a king or a queen, or really, want to have the best palace around, you need a lot of good water. You need good water for washing yourself, washing your clothes, preparing food, cooking. You might want water for your livestock and your deer, and you might even want to have a fountain in your garden. You're going to need some water. Now, Hampton Court had a number of supplies of fresh water. I'm digressing to start with, just to put it a little bit in perspective, because some people get these confused with the Longford. The first supply that we know of comes from Hampton. Now, this is drinking water. So this is spring water that comes from the spring in Hampton. It's no longer there, but there is a road there called Spring Vale. Big giveaway. And there's a house there once called the Conduit House. Again, dead giveaway. And there was a conduit that took water from Hampton along the river into Hampton Court Palace. Part of Cardinal Wolsey, the first inhabitant of Hampton Court Palace, part of his supply came from Hampton. Not very good, kept breaking down, kept leaking, so they needed another one. And I'm going to briefly touch on the Combe Conduit. Now, I think you've had a talk on this. Fascinating story, the Combe Conduit. That's where Hampton Court Palace gets its drinking water from, its fresh drinking water from. From about 1530s, Henry VIII's time, and this was in operation right through into the mid-1800s, so it lasted a very long time, and that drew water from Combe. Combe, Combe Hill, up in Kingston, up top of the hill there, because that is 50 metres above Hampton Court Palace, and that spring was enough, there was enough pressure and flow in that spring to bring water down from Combe, Kingston Hill, under the River Thames, through Hampton Court, and gave fresh drinking water to the palace for over 100 years. So much pressure, in fact, you could get water to the second floor. You could turn a tap, and there you were with fresh, lovely, fresh drinking spring water. They did that with lead pipes. There's a picture of an elm pipe there. That's how it used to be, but this is a lead pipe. And they had two side by side, in case one broke down. And there's Combe Conduit House, which you can still visit. I think it's one of those open garden schemes. I think you can visit it once or twice a year. Well worth a visit. Fascinating place. Anyway, onwards about the Longford River, because although Combe was giving you lots of lovely drinking water, and the Thames was nearby to give your transport into London, and probably to throw your wastewater in as well, there wasn't really a very good water supply bringing water into the gardens or the park of Home Park, Hampton Court or Bushy. And it was Charles I who wanted to bring water from Longford, which is up near Heathrow Airport. It's not very glamorous, I'm afraid. Via places like Bedfont, Feltham, Hanworth, Hampton Hill, into Bushy Park, through Bushy Park, and finally finding its way into Hampton Court Palace. About 11 miles. The new cut was designed by Nicholas Lane, who also laid out a lot of what we know as Richmond Park today. And the contractor took about 10 months to do it. Now, I don't believe that. So I think there was already a bit of a river there, and there was a few ditches, and I think he made the best of what he had to cut this through. But anyway, it was done in 1638, and it brought water from Longford off the River Colne into Hampton Court Palace. But the first thing I always think about, and I've been keep asking myself this whenever I do this talk, is why was the Longford Court built at that time? And one of the problems was, is you read a lot, and it will say, well, the reason why the Longford was built because they always say Henry VIII wanted to have a fountain. Well, he was long gone, so it was Charles I. Charles I wanted to have these wonderful water gardens with ponds and lakes and fountains. Well, that's not true. At that time, the palace was mainly empty. The expenditure was very, very low. And they weren't planning any great schemes in the gardens. And Charles was soon to have his head chopped off anyway. So things weren't great. But the answer could be that both Bushy and Home Park had no natural water. So they had no natural water flow. All the ponds that you see, whether it be the Diana or the Leg of Mutton or the Heron now, they're all part of the Longford River scheme. And although there was a spring and a ditch at Hampton Hill and in Hampton, it really gave very little water. And Hampton Court also had very little water apart from the Thames. We do know that in the mid-1630s, right through to 38, they had 3 consecutive years of drought. Hard drought. But imagine our summer of 76. They had 3 years in a row like that. Now, that must have been you imagine Bushy Park or Home Park in that kind of dry period. They lost animals, livestock died, and they had an awful problem with water. That, I think, is one of the reasons. They wanted to bring water, normal water, river water, into Bushy and Home Park. It wasn't for drinking. You couldn't drink it. You certainly wouldn't, unless you had a death wish, you certainly wouldn't have drunk this water after it had travelled 11 miles from Longford. So it was really purely just to bring water, I think, into the gardens and the park, Bushy Park and Home Park. Another reason is this, gentleman, and we must really, with a friend of mine, Richard Clark, who's been studying the Hanworth end of Hanworth Park. To understand the Longford, he always says you have to understand Hanworth Park. And for a few years I wondered what he meant. And this gentleman here, Lord Cottingham, was the Chancellor, basically the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had control over the funds in which the King would spend. Well, it just so happens he lived at Hanworth. And he was able to persuade people, I believe, to bring the river through his estate. So it ticked a few boxes. It brought river water to Hampton Court, Bushy Park, but it also brought water through Hanworth Park. And it was Lord Cottingham that signed it off, who gave the grant to the contractors to do the work. So, slightly fraudulent, but it doesn't matter. So where does it begin? Modestly, it begins behind what used to be Mrs. Ellis at number 16, Heathrow Close. The Longford begins. It's not very romantic, is it? Like the Nile or the Zambezi. It's behind number 16 in Heathrow Close. Mrs. Ellis was a lady that I visited a few times. She's no longer there. It's the end house. And if you used to have to wave to her through the door because she thought you were suspicious. He went down the side of the house, climbed over a fence, and there, if you reach over the top of the fence with your camera, you can see the split. And here, the magic begins, the start of the journey of the Longford River. And you can see that the Colne at the top there carries on its way through the Colne Valley and into Staines, and eventually out into the River Thames at the Staines. And the Longford piers off here through a rather big lump of concrete and starts its journey on its way down to Hampton Court. Through some rather industrial gates and weirs, it starts, and off it goes. So, if you were thinking of a dramatic waterfall or a mountain volcano spring, I'm afraid you're disappointed. It's rather normal. And its journey starts in a rather industrial area as well. You probably know where I am here. And now's a good time there's the Colne, the Longford there starting its journey through here. And you'll notice a parallel river starting to creep alongside. This is Heathrow, by the way. More about that in a second. So I'll introduce this river now. Again, another topic, another subject of a whole new conversation, and I think a book's been written on this, the Duke of Northumberland River, or the Don, as we call it. That's a much earlier man-made river, and that starts its journey, again, off the Colne, here, and it runs parallel with the Longford. As Heathrow expanded, they pushed both rivers back, further back, and then Heathrow expanded again, and both rivers got pushed back again. We're very lucky to have them both. They could have easily disappeared. The Duke of the Don, we'll go back to the Don. The Don carries on, peers off slightly in a different direction, and eventually ends up in Twickenham. You might have seen near Twickenham Rugby Ground, wondering what that river is running alongside there, and then eventually goes into the Crane, then becomes the Don again, and ends up in Syon Park, the big piece of water in Syon Park. That's part of the Don, and then eventually out into the Thames at Isleworth. So that goes in that direction. The Longford heads south, down towards Hampton Court and Bushy Park. This is a map pre-Heathrow Airport, and here we can see rather straight man-made kind of canal. And there's the Longford. And you see they almost join. Heathrow was a huge development, started in the 1940s, I think, early 40s, through the 40s and into the 50s. And the purple area is how much Heathrow has expanded over the years. And you can see both of these rivers were really in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so they've been pushed over to the much further south. This is their old run. See, when you get up to the Longford village, you can walk along here and see this bridge, the King's Bridge, at the village of Longford. It goes over the old Bath Road. And it's a marker, really, to note that the Longford, if you like, was a royal river for many years, or classed as a royal river. So all maintenance work, bridges, repairs, all had to be carried out by the Crown. And to much the same as it is today. So you find a lot of the bridges and artefacts around it are marked with crests. As I say, they both run parallel for a number of miles around Heathrow. It's very industrial, definitely not romantic or picturesque, and it's functional. Through the talk, I'll just pick out some points where there's some interesting facts about different journeys on the river. You may have noted I've started at the beginning and I'm working my way downriver, and we're just going to pick out a few pots. There's a lot going on in between, but we're just going to pick out a few of the moments. The first location is the two bridges, and this had always been a problem historically for many, many years, because it's where the Longford and the Don finally part company. They've been running parallel and mostly for a couple of miles, and they finally split. The Longford going south, and the Don heading off towards Syon Park. And this two bridges was a major problem for engineers for many, many years, until they put this major road through. And it was a favoured spot for kids to play in the water splash. I'm not going to ask if anyone in the audience remembers. Talk about Hanworth now, because as I said at the beginning, to understand Hanworth, and I think you get an understanding of the Longford, of why it's come about. This is one of the early maps that we can find of the area. Here's Hampton Court down here, and here's the Longford. The ground at Hanworth levels out quite considerably, and it must have become quite difficult for the engineers to get any flow. So they constructed a series of zigzags in the river with weirs and cascades to bring the water forward, step by step. Here it's called the New River. It tells us it's quite an early map. Other places we find it called, I think this one, we find it called the Cardinals River. It's very strange. Would refer to a river that would be from the 1520s. That can't be right if they're saying it's built in 1630. Another drawing map will say it's the King's River. Others say it's the Longford Stream. Others say it's the New Cut. So it does get renamed quite a few times through history before it finally ends up as it should be, which is the Longford River. And the river at Hamworth gets put underground because of the aerodrome there that they built in the 1920s and through into the 30s. Hamworth Air Park was a very large operation for the Whitworth Aircraft Company, who were making aeroplanes there and flying from there regularly before Heathrow Airport had been developed. And the Longford was rather awkwardly coming through the middle of the runway. Well, that wasn't going to work, and aeroplanes were constantly falling into the ditches. They had tried planking it over it with big boards. That hadn't worked either. So they decided to bury the Longford under 2 stretches of culvert. You can see men at work constructing one of these culverts. I call them culverts, you might call them tunnels in the 1920s. But here, this would have been a runway here, or one of the runways. So here's the Longford here coming in. It abruptly stops, and they put it underground. It goes on for about 600-800 yards. It pops up again in Hamworth House here. And here, this picture was taken before it gets covered again. Its claim to fame is that it had a Zeppelin land on it, so that's pretty good. Not many rivers can say they had a Zeppelin next to them. So quite a major construction. Must have cost them an awful lot of money to do, but it would have seemed worth it because the company was really expanding. And Hamworth Air Park, we might know it as Feltham Air Parks now. I think some people call it with the swimming pool and the leisure centre. And was thought to be where Heathrow was going to be. But as we all know, it didn't work out like that, and Heathrow got moved up further north. It's all quite industrial, isn't it? We haven't seen any kingfishers yet, or we haven't seen any herons sweeping majestically through the river. It's all quite industrial, quite built up, and I'm afraid it will continue for a little bit longer until we see the nice green bits. The next wonderful location is Sainsbury's. Again, you see all this river's going on behind, right under your noses when you're shopping, and there it is. If you just look over the fence, and there you'll see it. So here's Sainsbury's at Hampton Hill, and here's the Longford. Now, here, something magical happens. It meets the mill. Now, you can't see that. That's behind sort of a closed gated area, but you can, if you come off this footbridge, and you can walk along there. And I think that's still a public footpath. The mill, Hampton Mill, was the first mill on the Longford River. We think it was built before 1808, but the next building was built at 1800, but the first one may have been a little bit earlier. And at this point in the Longford, there is a drop, or they made a drop. Naturally, the ground drops quite significantly there, and I think it was just exaggerated and built up, and the embankments were created to create a drop. This is an early drawing sketch of what the mill looked like there, and you can see the drop was enough to power a water wheel, and that water wheel initially was used as a mill would be, just to grind grain or wheat or barley, and they produced flour from there. But it wasn't particularly successful, and it wasn't very profitable either. The mill later went on to power a mains water supply. Now, I'm not going to talk about this too much because I really will digress. But suffice to say, the mill was one of the first areas where people could get relatively fresh drinking water. The mill, the wheel, drove a pump. Remember, this is early 1800s. Drove a pump. Water went into a filter bed, then into a suction well, and water was then pumped down a pipe that went all the way to Hampton Court. So a very early mains drinking water system, long before Thames Water at Hampton. And there's a long lead pipe all the way to Hampton Court Palace. But you'll also see a blue pipe there as well. And this blue pipe is what we would call, some call it other things, the gravity system. Now you might have heard that. Gravity, 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 gravity. All of those systems are powered by gravity water coming from that Hampton Mill. Not from someone pumping water or turning a tap off the mains. I nearly said pumped then. They draw water from gravity. I doubt the diner ever worked as good as that, but I'd like to think it did. Wouldn't it be lovely to work like that all the time? Our fountain at Hampton Court Palace, the East Front fountain, still powered by gravity today. You just turn a key and that water from the mill running down that pipe, that 25 foot, is enough drop to push that water down. Fountain Court in Hampton Court and the pond gardens at Hampton Court, their little fountains in there all gravity. And we have the last remaining gravity WC, Hampton Court. Pull the chain and river water comes down. It's the last surviving loo. All loos were powered by this system once, but this is the last surviving one at Hampton Court. Moving on down the river, we come to another mill. This one is in Windmill Lane, Hampton. There's a pub there, isn't there, called the Windmill. Is it still? Another pub bites the dust. This windmill at Hampton was the biggest building for miles around. So if you imagine, there was no houses, buildings, shops or anything in Hampton or Hampton Hill. So it was said that you could see this windmill for miles and miles. You could stand in the middle of Bushy Park or anywhere and you could see this windmill for miles around. It was a real landmark. It has its very own aqueduct. Did you know that? You probably did, yes. You don't often get to see it. It's behind closed doors. I think a few houses that might live close by get a very good view of it. But Hampton Hill Aqueduct, are very modest, but it had to be built because the incoming Thames Valley line coming from Fulwell and going on down to Hampton from Teddington was coming its way. They had to divert the Longford River through an aqueduct and the Longford Main, and the pipe, that gravity pipe as well, had to go through there and had to go over the railway line. So it was quite a major engineering feat to do all that. Read this sign to you because I think it's lovely. Police have been instructed to take anyone into custody who interferes with the River Longford. I just think that's lovely, isn't it? Police have been instructed to take into custody anyone who interferes or damages the banks of the River Longford by order of Secretary. I think that's lovely. Well, this is all part of the Longford. Without the Longford, Lord Halifax wouldn't have been able to build his wonderful gardens up at Hampton because the water for it comes off the Longford, and he diverted it into his gardens to make a wonderful, beautiful water garden around about 1710, 1712, something like that. Halifax was the ranger and had quite a lot of power, quite a lot of influence as well. So it can't have been that straightforward to convince the powers that be that he was going to take this water from the Longford, which was feeding Hampton Court Palace and all the royal ponds and fountains there, and he was going to build his own water garden. So he must have had quite a bit of influence. But by 1710, the William and Mary had departed Hampton Court, so there was a lull, and I think that's probably what made it possible. And you can still visit it today, and it's a really lovely place to see it. He only borrowed the water, really, because the water comes in, goes down this cascade, as it does today, and then returns back into the Longford and then continues his merry way. So he's technically only really borrowing the water, although a bit of it does carry on through to that. And here it is in the survey of 1868. So it probably had fallen slightly into disrepair by then. here it is coming across the railway bridge, around, under the road there at Hampton Hill, down into his two basins, I suppose, and then would have returned to the Longford. This is an interesting job because I'm not sure what that is. I've looked at this a few times because it falls outside his gardens. It doesn't seem to be part of his gardens. It's not part of the grand scheme. There's no painting of it. I suppose it could have been an interesting part of the garden, but it seems more functional to me. But it's quite a big basin. It's bigger than that. And also this drawing, it says it's proposed engine, proposed filters, and proposed high service tank in the brew house. You know, the brew house there. You had a tour over there. Well, by 1860s, that probably had long defunct, I suspect, and had stopped making beer. Proposed high service tank. Might think that perhaps they were thinking of pumping water into the rafters of there. That would give the drop, perhaps high pressure system to run back to Hampton Court. Whether this was actually realised or not, I don't really know. To be investigated further along. There's that red pipe again, which tells me that the main system is running back to Hampton Court, it's going in the right direction, and then there's another pipe here, going off here. So these are all mains systems running powered through gravity. But we are at Hampton Court Palace when we do our garden research. We kind of the archive is so vast, and luckily because it's Hampton Court Palace, it gets mapped a lot, it gets surveyed a lot, and our archive is very extensive. And so we're able to look upon maps going right back to 200, 300, 400 years. We're very, very lucky. And sometimes they give us a little bit of information about other things that we didn't think about. And although I've been aware of this is the Bridgeman, what we call the Bridgeman plan for Hampton Court and Bushy Park. Been aware of this for a number of years. I've never really studied it in relation to the Longford River. Here we have the river coming in, Halifax's water gardens, that strange sort of basin there, and then it going through now what we know as the woodland gardens you can walk along there if you're heading from one side to another. And then you can see by this time, this is about 1730, ponds had started to be developed in Bushy Park. The Longford was now feeding the Leg of Mutton Pond, Dinah was in there, or this basin was in there, and there was quite an extensive system of streams going through there by 1730. So it didn't take long. Although the Longford was designed purely to go to Hampton Court Palace and supply water to Home Park, Hampton Court, and maybe a bit in Bushy Park, it didn't take long before the water started to spread out into Bushy Park a little bit more. But when I look at this, I was reading these things, and I'd taken for granted. There's two things that puzzle me. One was, it says new reservoir and canal, number 14, and number 15, old reservoir and canal. And I'd never really thought of taking them into, there's number 15, 14 is somewhere there. I'd never really looked at them with any great detail until I went for a walk. Now, you may know this. You may know this, or anyone in Bushy Park, but I didn't know this. If you go for a walk over there, and you probably know this, you might know this bridge, that you can't get to it, but you can see it from the woodland garden, looking back up the Longford. Lovely sort of sunset comes from there. Shame you can't get to it, you just want to go over it, don't you? If you walk on a bit further, there's these big expanses of areas here, and they're dug square. I had a look. They're dug, they're hollowed out. They're reservoirs. They're reservoirs, nothing else. They may look like other things, but they're dips in the ground. They're man-made reservoirs. There's one there, and if we walk further on towards the Waterhouse Pond, there's one there as well. And these reservoirs did exactly what they said on the tin. They were reservoirs that held large quantities of water for when you needed it to push more water down into Bushy Park ponds or into Hampton Court. So they were kind of holding. They were reservoirs, but they're obviously now great nature reserves and wonderful habitat. This is you know this is the Waterhouse Pond, and kind of where the Longford reaches a comes to an end, and more wonderful things happen here, or did. magic happens here. This is like this is unusual. This is not built just to have a balustrade where you stand there and feed ducks. There's something more to that building than meets the eye, I think. It's pretty heavy-duty construction. I think it had a much rather serious building on top of it once. This is a very interesting little building as well. It's called the pump house. Why's it got a chimney? I was puzzled. Has it had a pump or a fire? It's too small to have a steam engine in it, but an interesting little building. This is a drawing, a painting from 1705 Hampton Court. Finally, the Longford, almost 100 years after it was born or begun, its purpose started to be served. It finally found a purpose. And what they wanted to do, and they did build this is the grand scheme at Hampton Court for William and Mary at the end of the 17th century. A wonderful parterre garden, the privy garden, the wilderness, the tilt yards. This particular garden had 13 fountains in it. Massive. It was built. A huge, great Versailles type garden with the biggest Baroque formal garden in the whole of the UK. Was meant to challenge the Baroque gardens of Versailles and Fontainebleau and those other gardens in France. This was Britain's answer to that. Massive. But boy, did you need a lot of water for those fountains. Now the water was going to come from here. The reservoirs would have supported this. This is very deep as well, by the way. Very, very deep. Don't fall in there. The water was going to come from here, and in this painting, it's pictured. Something is drawn here. That's exactly where this is. Looks bigger than what that is now. And the reason why I suspect that is that there is a historic account that accounts for 3,000 foot of lead pipe. So with my Google Earth, and it's a wonderful, if ever you go on Google Earth, it's a wonderful thing. You can measure things on Google Earth. I measured from Lion Gate to this building, and it's 3,020 feet. That's where the water was going to come from, to power these 13 fountains by gravity. Well, it was never going to happen. And it never did properly happen. They tried all kinds of wonderful things to get these 13 fountains going. They just didn't have the drop. 30 feet at that point. Hampton Court, where the water comes in, 23. So you only had a 7.5 foot drop. But nowhere near amount of drop you need to push an awful lot of water down a pipe to get it to spurt up 13 fountains. It was never going to work. It was a complete failure. It didn't last long, and within 10 years the 13 fountains had gone, and we're now left with the one that you know if you visit Hampton Court. Just the last one is remaining, and the other 12 are underground, waiting to be discovered one day by some well-meaning archaeologists. But this is an important part of the Longford journey, this Waterhouse Pond. Things happen here, or did happen here. It wasn't just a pretty water garden. It was a real industrial hub for the Longford. Let's all start calling it Arethusa, shall we? Not Diana. That's never going to catch on, is it, Peter? No. We're going to be calling Arethusa Diana for a little. It's not Diana, it's Arethusa. But I think that water comes from the Waterhouse Pond through a culvert and goes into the Diana, which we know. I'm going to call it Diana. Everyone does, doesn't it? Goes into the Diana. Oops. Goes into the Diana, and Diana acts like a kind of a Longford River roundabout. And it's the Diana that decides where water's going to go. So it balances it all out. A bit. This is where I fight with the Bushy Park superintendent, because I want more going to Hampton Court, and he wants more going down to the Leg Mutton and the Heron. So we have a bit of an arm wrestle over this over many years. Ray Brodie, my dear friend who's now retired, had often a good old argument over the phone about the quantity of water being put to Hampton Court compared to what was going down. The Heron and the Leg of Mutton Pond, a bit of a swimming exercise going on there. Two ponds that we know and love. very well. That wouldn't have been there at all if it wasn't for the Longford River. They would. Diana, you probably know where you are there with the Porter's Stream, I think is what people sometimes call it today. It was called the Children's Nook and was a recognised and understood children's paddling pool area. Lovely, quaint little spot. They even had a little ledge for the kids to sit on. Lovely. And it's still nice now. Well done to the Royal Parks who look after this area really, really well. It's still a nice little space there. Probably more dogs than kids now, I suspect, enjoying that swim. I know my dog likes to swim through there. I shouldn't say that. No. On a lead, of course. When it reaches through down Porter Stream, it does a sharp left turn. There's a valve there, which is a pass-through, which we can operate and bring water straight under the road into Hampton Court. But generally we don't use it. We let the water go through into another culvert after it's gone through 3 people's back gardens on Hampton Court Road, underneath the road, Hampton Court Road, and then pops up in Hampton Court in the canals that run round the east front, where it gently eases its way around the east front gardens through these man-made canals to finally do its biggest thing and expose its glory to everything and everyone, is the long water at Hampton Court Palace. 3/4 of a mile long expanse of water. This doesn't come though until 1660, so if you imagine the Longford was built in 1639, it had to wait a long time before it really got to be used to its full potential. And it does in the Long Water. This is a very early painting of the Long Water going up to Hampton Court. Before, you will note, the Wren building and the early 18th century facade. These are the old buildings, the old Tudor buildings on that side. There's the canals that we know, and the water tumbles over and heads off down the Long Water, heading down towards the Thames. But it didn't always do that. The Long Water is another man-made structure to make Charles II feel grand and important, as Long Water and avenues made the King's Deed. It went that way, down there. Someone was asking me the other day what this big ditch was in the park, and it's quite a common question. What's that big ditch in the park? Is it? I know what it is, and they always used to say, it's the Colne conduit, isn't it? No, it's not. It's the old Longford. You can see it there, going down. If you're ever in Home Park, have a wander over there, and you'll see this big ditch. That's the old Longford River. Don't forget, though, it is man-made. It's not a natural river. It's a man-made river, hence why it's dead straight. That would have gone all the way down, meet Stud House, and then gone off and joined Hampton Wick Pond. So Hampton Wick Pond was originally part of the Longford River that had been diverted down there. There's a better picture here. There it is there, the old Longford, going off down that way, down towards Hampton Wick. It was diverted in 1660 to build the Long Water. So do have a wander up there. The reason why it stops there, I think, is because of the Colne conduit. It couldn't go any further into the park, couldn't go across this way. The land gets quite high, and the river to make it easier, they made the river follow the low ground. But if it had gone any further back, so here, the Colne conduit runs from this clump of trees here in Stud House right along here. The Longford had to turn left. It couldn't go across the Colne conduit or under the Colne conduit. It had to turn left. So hence it runs down towards Hampton Wick. And it runs almost parallel, very, very closely with the Colne conduit, which is the underground pipe that brings water from Kingston. So here's an overhead view. Here's the water's made its way through to Diana, through the canals. A bit carries on, comes out of the Thames, down on the barge walk. The majority goes down the Longwater. And as I said, there's the old Longford, which would have eventually done this. Joined the Hampton Wick Pond, and then eventually found its way out into the Thames, probably where Kingston Bridge is now. If ever you're walking around Hampton Wick Pond, about halfway down, the river does a bit of an angle, does a bit of a twist, and there's a lump in the middle. There's a little bit of a lump the other side. We've got an old drawing that shows this pond split into two. I think there was a cascade there, myself. I think there's a drop, and there was some kind of weir, because that's a rather big lake on a sloping bit of ground. But I think that was broken into two, and the river tumbled down into there. The river's obviously been widened, that Longford was widened out quite a bit, and that it is said, although I've never found any documentary evidence, that the water here from when it was frozen was taken to the ice house, which is nearby. Mm. Gone 11 miles from Mrs. Ellis at number 16, down this way, and we're in the overflow ponds, which are at the end of the Longwater. Pity they couldn't have a more nicer name. They're just called the overflow ponds, but just the water just sort of overflows into them. But they did serve a purpose once. This whole area down here was once a garden called the Wilderness. It wasn't, again, very long-lived. It wasn't successful because this whole area flooded very badly. But there was a garden here called the Wilderness, and these overflow ponds were part of that garden. It was a bit like a garden out from a garden. From your royal garden, you could gallop on your horse if you were a king or queen and go to the end of the Longwater. Then you could have a nice wander around your garden there, but it didn't really take off. But you can, if you look closely at this overhead, you can see marks on the ground that sort of show the outline of this garden. From here, the overflow, it feeds the Rick Pond, part of the Longford, which throws out water into some ditches here. But the majority goes into two ditches. One that comes out by Ravensgate, I'll show you that in a minute, and the other one that follows a stream that runs along parallel with our boundary fence and heading off around Hampton Court, Hampton Wick, and another one feeds a little stream that goes into the reed bed there. The end, again, like the beginning, is rather abrupt and without any ceremony. There is no great fanfare or water god blasting on a trumpet. The water tumbles out into a culvert and then comes out by Ravensgate. Good place to fish, by the way, because the two changes in temperatures of the water. There, I always have a look at that when I'm walking past, just to make sure it's all running nicely. The other one, next time you're walking over Kingston Bridge, on the War Memorial side, have a look down, look down there. That's the last trickle of Longford water coming your way, that eventually finds itself into this big box, into a pipe that heads off down towards Kingston Bridge. And again, I shouldn't be telling, I'm sure this lady might not be very happy, but if you're walking over Kingston Bridge, again, the Memorial side, just have a look over the edge and you see this. There's an opening, a cobbled culvert there, and that is the final 11.2 miles end of the Longford River. Thank you very much.